Hello everyone, I'm back, and in this little video I'm going to show you how to paint this autumn postcard. I love painting postcards, they really do make great gifts. And if you spray them afterwards with some clear varnish, you can just pop them in the post and they arrive remarkably unscathed. I'm working from this photograph I took on my way home the other day, a very iconic scene around here near Watercolour. If you want to paint with me, here are some of the things you're going to need. Piece of watercolor paper cut down to postcard size, your paints and clean water, piece of paper toweling, particularly for mistakes, some round brushes, pencil, eraser, a white marker, and a marker with either black or brown ink. First up, I do a light pencil sketch, and I start with the shed because I want to make sure that that fits on my postcard and that I've got it in the right place. And then I just work around adding in the trees in the field until I'm happy with my drawing. In case you're wondering, no, I don't actually draw this fast. I've speeded this up 20 times. To keep trees interesting and to make them look kind of realistic, you'll notice that I vary the shapes and the heights of them quite a lot. So here, when I'm drawing the poplars, you'll see that they are all different heights and different shapes. And also I add in some of the poplars that have already lost their leaves to make sure that it really does look like it's autumn. Pencil drawing all done. Now it's time to add some color. And before I do that, I use a little spritzer just to wet my paints and to make them nice and juicy. I'm going to start with the hut, and I'm going to use a medium size, well, it's actually quite small size round brush, and I'm going to start with the roof first. And for that I'm mixing here what I found is a really good corrugated iron color, which is cerulean blue, and a wonderful color made by my Mary called Dragon's Blood. Well, it has a wonderful name anyway. It's a dark reddish brown, and that works really well for adding rust spots to corrugated iron. Throughout the painting process, you'll see me continuously go back to that piece of paper toweling. I use that to test my color, particularly if I've made a mix, and I also use it to test how much water I've got on my brush. So instead of having a piece of watercolor or a piece of rough watercolor paper on my side to do that, I just use a paper towel. To make the corrugated iron roof look like it's shiny, you'll see that I don't paint it a solid blue color. I paint in little stripes, leaving the whites as highlights, and this creates an impression that the roof is shiny. And then while the blue is still wet, I drop in that dragon's blood color to create those rust spots, and they just bleed out softly into the blue. Once the roof is done, I clean and dry my brush, and I mix up the colors that I'm going to use for the walls. I'm going to start with the wall that's on the shadow side, the wall that's facing us, and then do the side that's in the sunshine. So I'm mixing up a range of different browns here. You can just have fun with whatever is on your palette. I start with my lightest color first, and as I progress you'll see me adding in darker and darker colors. In order to give a building some weight, I find it's really effective if you add the darker colors towards the bottom of the walls. And if you think about it, that makes sense because the sun is usually quite high up and the tops of the walls will be lighter and the shadows will be cast more towards the bottom of the walls. Where the wall meets the ground, you'll notice that I tease the color out a little bit, doing what we call negative painting to shape the grasses that are underneath. So I don't paint a solid line across the bottom of the shed. I want it to look like it's integrated into the ground. So yes, I'm feathering it out there and creating some grasses that I'm going to paint later. This really is quite an old shed, and the roof has fallen apart quite a lot. And I think what's in between the corrugated iron is some old shingles or wood or something. So now that the corrugated iron part of the roof is dry, I can go back in between and add some browns that will represent wood. I'm going to speed up again now. Once I've finished with the shadow side of the hut, I'm going to go back in and do the side that's catching the light. And for this, I'm going to use very, very light color so that there's a very distinct contrast between that side that's getting the light and the darker side. The old shed is all done now, except for its cast shadows, which I'm going to do later. And now I'm going to work on the field that's in the front. And for that, I'm going to use all the colors I've already mixed, but I'm also going to add in some green. And I'm going to change to a much larger round brush because it's a big area and I can be quite free here. To create that rough texture of the field in front, it's quite fun just to add in a whole lot of colors. So you'll see me changing from the greens to the browns and the reddish browns. And I also change my strokes, so sometimes I'm working quite horizontal and sometimes I flick the brush to create grasses. My brush has quite a sharp point, so it can create quite fine grasses, and I just really have some fun. I don't think too much, I just let go here. My first pass at the field is quite light with very watery paint, and as I progress I add richer and richer color, and this gives the impression that there are grasses and bushes there without me actually painting them. Right, the field is all done and it's time for the trees. So of course we're going to need some yellow. I'm going to do the trees entirely in yellow to begin with and then drop in some darker colors. So I've changed to that smaller round brush again, and here you'll see me mixing up that first yellow. And I hold my brush quite loosely and in a kind of upright position, and I loosely dance it across the page to create the leaves. You'll see I leave a lot of gaps of white. That's for the birds to fly through, as Bob Ross would say. And sometimes I break out from the main clump of trees and I have some loose leaves on the outside. That just gives the impression that there's a sense of movement and that the painting isn't static. I fill in the entire clump of poplars with that nice golden yellow. And yes, just a reminder that I keep it kind of loose and that the trees vary in shape and size. Once I have this first layer down all entirely in yellow, and while it's still wet, I'm going to drop in some orange. So I've got a nice bright orange here, and I'm going to just drop it in various places. I drop it in particularly on the right hand side because the sun is coming from the left and I want the left hand side of the trees to be more golden in color. But I don't really think about it too much, and again sometimes I break it out with some loose leaves on the outside of the trees. And I'm still reserving some little white patches for the birds to fly through. And then once I've got all the orange in, I come back in again. It's still very wet with a dark brown, and I drop this really particularly on the bottom right to give the trees some weight to them, and also because that's where the deepest shadow is. You'll also see that although these brown patches represent leaves, you'll see me dragging them in to create trunks as well. And yes, it's very wet and the trunks are going to bleed a lot, but you'll see later when we add the pen marks on this, it's all going to make sense. That's the poplars all done, or at least the first pass at them, and now I'm going to work on the other autumn tree that's on the left hand side. And I'm going to do it in exactly the same way with a yellow and then a golden color and then a brown. But I'm going to use a different yellow, a different golden color and a different brown so that although it's still autumny, it's not the same as the poplars. On the right hand side of the hut, I'm going to paint some green trees. And I'm going to do the same method as I did for the autumn ones, except that instead of starting with a base color of yellow, I'm going to start with a base color of a light green. And then I'm just going to do all of the trees in the light green, big mass of them, varying them in shape. And then I'll drop in a darker color along the bottom, same way as I did the other trees. Now it's time to do the dead tree, and for that I'm going to use a much smaller round brush, and if you have a rigger brush and you know how to use it, that would be perfect. I mix up a very dark brown, so lots of pigment and almost no color, and it's difficult for me to show you here, but you'll see I keep my brush in a really upright position and I flick it with the lightest touch on the paper to create the branches. I'm sorry my hand really does block this, but there isn't a good way of filming it. The trick here really is just to keep your hand and your brush really loose and just to create a whole lot of broken flickery marks with the lightest touch to the page. If you are nervous, then have a practice on another piece of paper first, and then when you're all warmed up, you can come and add it to your postcard. And if you are really daunted, then don't even do this. Leave it out or just add these dead trees in later with a pen. Now that the trees are all dry, I thought it would be a good idea to add a lot more darks around the back of the hut so that the hut would come forward. So you see me here mixing in a very dark brown by mixing a Payne's grey with my dark brown. And then I drop this in a jaggedy type of mark around the edge of the hut and in the bottom of the trees. And then before this dries, you'll see me clean and dry my brush, and then with that wet brush I just run it along the edge of those marks to soften them so that they're not hard everywhere at least. Yes, I'm much happier with that now. It feels to me like the shed is way more prominent, so I'm going to do the same thing to the poplars that are behind. Dark darks really do make a difference in a watercolor, so don't be afraid to add them. Now it's time to add the shadows. And for me, this is really where a watercolor just all starts coming together. I'm going to work on the shadows for the hut first, so I'm mixing up a bluey gray, touch of purple in there. And you'll see that the cast shadow from the roof is kind of interesting. It's not just a line across. The roof is broken and there are lots of gaps and that let the sunlight come through. So look at it carefully and copy that angle and those sunlight marks. Also, I add in some darks for where the corrugated iron is casting shadow onto the wood. But yeah, look carefully at your reference photo because cast shadows do make a huge difference. The hut and the poles also cast shadows onto the ground, and for that I use the green that I've mixed with the Payne's grey. Anybody wondering what I'm going to do with that big white area that's on the right? Well, I've got a plan. I didn't want this to be a complete painting. I wanted it to look like a sketch, so I didn't add in the sky and the mountains. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my big round brush with lots of water, and I'm going to splatter in some yellows and oranges. Looks like, I don't know, that there's some leaves blowing or something. And now I wait for the sketch to completely dry, and then I'm going to come in and add some pen work. I'm using a fountain pen with a very fine nib and some very dark brown ink. Black ink would work fine, but I just felt that with this autumn scene that a brown ink would work better. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate particularly on the hut, and I'm only going to really draw dark lines where there's the shadows that are cast. So on the side that it catches the light, I do hardly any marks, and on the sides where there's a heaviness or a shadow, I come in with darker and darker marks. I love adding the pen work. To me it feels like this is where it all comes together and my painting really pops. I work all around the hut and the poles and the foreground, just starting off kind of light and then going darker and darker. I add in a few grasses and the fence post wires, and then when that's all done, I can come into the trees and add in some trunks. Particularly on the dead tree, I can sharpen up any marks there as well. Oh, it's really starting to look pretty cute right now. And I'm finished with the brown ink and I'm just going to add some sparkle with a white marker. I do this particularly where the sun is catching, so on the sides of the poles which are in the light and on the tops of the roof, and a few marks in the trees as well. Some grasses along the bottom of the hut and in the field. It really just adds some sparkle. And look at that, we are done. Don't forget to sign your masterpiece. If you've enjoyed following along with the postcard, you might be interested in doing the full scene. And I have a video for this, the full scene, on my website, and I'll pop a link in the description below. If you do paint a postcard, I would love to see it. So please make sure you send it to me. I do hope you give it a go. Have fun painting. I'll see you soon. Ciao.